In this recording, we're going to talk about how to get started in Premiere Pro. When you first open the software, you may see something that looks a little bit like this, but if you've never opened it before, rather than having previous work, you might have some suggestions and tutorials and stuff that will help you get started. I think it's also really handy because you can go to their learning materials, which might be very useful for you. But in the short term, let's start a new project. When you go to start a new project, you want to give it a name that's meaningful to you, and you want to tell it where you want that to live. So at the moment, I have a drive selected, and I have a place where I normally put things, but if you haven't decided that yet, you can use the Browse tool to find where you want to put your stuff. Now, one of the things that I find particularly helpful, and I always advise this for any nonlinear editing software, regardless of what it is that you put your project and your media on a drive that has nothing to do with where the software is running. And so what I mean is the normal internal drive of the computer, which is often designated as a C drive or as your internal hard drive, is where you would install the application. It's not where I would necessarily want to stash your project file or your media. So I will generally choose another drive, as I have done, an external drive, to put my project and my media on. That's just how I tend to work. And then the other thing is that when you're in here, if you did want to say, for instance, put your project file in one place and your media in another, it's important to know that you will have to choose where these things go, because by default it will all go to where your project is saved. So if your project is by default saved in the Documents folder of the C drive in an Adobe folder for all the Premiere Pro stuff that it wants to make, it'll just by default put everything in there, and you may need to choose where you want to put things. So one of the things that's also really important is your autosave vault. Now that is something I will put in the Documents folder, and I do have my Documents Adobe Premiere Pro, and that's there. That's really handy because it's just a backup file. You're not actively using it, and it's stored in a different location to your actual project file. The reason why that's important is because, say for instance, I have my project on an external drive, and that drive, magically goes down in a technological flaming nightmare of only dreams we can describe. If you have something go wrong where you have a corruption of files, data loss, a drive failure, you want your backup to be somewhere else. You don't want it to be on the same drive as your project file. So as you're going through and you're just quickly setting up a job, I would suggest that one of the things you should check is to make sure your project autosave is in a different place to the rest of your job. That, I think, is pretty stripping down. So once you've got that done, there is another setting here for ingest, but ingest we don't generally need to manage too much. So ingest is usually when you're bringing material in from a different source in such a way that you need to duplicate it and physically make files. What we're going to be doing is working with linked files, which simply need to be told the location, not transcoded and brought into the application. So we're not going to bother with this right now, but if you did turn this on, you would notice that it would say, do I want to copy? Do I want to transcode? It's basically a handy thing if the media that you're working with is in a format that has nothing to do with how you're finishing your project, and you would need to transcode it anyways. So you could add ingest presets to a job, but we don't need to worry about that right now. So what I do need to know is that I am displaying my capture with whatever's going on here. We've got the audio, the time code, scratch disks. It's enough, right? So just make sure you've given it a name that makes sense and you've put it somewhere where you know where that project is. Then it'll have a little think, and it will open the job. So when you first come into this tool, you're looking at a whole bunch of nothing. It is a source window, a program window or record window, a timeline, a tool set, and a space to bring in media. And you have a little prompt here. It says import media to Sturt. And that's really important because even for me to show you how things work in here, contextually it makes almost no sense to do that until I have media in the system. So the thing that's really handy here is that you have this thing, it's called a media browser, and it will let you go digging around looking for files, and it's really handy. Now what I have here is a folder full of stuff, which I want, right? So I can either import this whole file by right-clicking, and it brings it in already in its bin, which is handy. The other way I could do it would be to go to this project window and right-click, and I could say I want to import from here, and then use the system browser to go to the folder and grab the folder, or grab individual files, or whatever it is I want to do. I can do that as well. But what I have done here is I have just brought something in so that we can get started in talking about how the edit space works. And as I hover over it, you'll see that it says 001 bin. Now, this is an old convention, and I think it's really important to speak to editing conventions. It doesn't matter what software you're using, they'll always have bins. And bins is a terminology that we can speak to. You can see a little icon here that looks like a folder. So it's kind of like an internal folder structure that's particular to the nonlinear editing environment. It doesn't necessarily mean that all of those files are in the same folder on your computer somewhere. You can actually bring disparate files from different locations and put them in one folder here. It doesn't change where they live on your computer or on your hard drives. The reason it looks like a folder is because it's a familiar icon that sort of speaks to organization. But the reason it's called a bin is because back in the oldie smoky days, when we used to do film editing with actual film, we used to hold film in these kind of like bins, and it was like a frame, like imagine the sort of thing that you get like in a commercial laundry service or in the hotel, where they're running around with a little trolley, and the trolley's lined with a fabric bag. That kind of bag is called a bin in terms of film editing, because what we used to have is a kind of metal frame that was a trolley, and above it had pegs that you would hang film off, and then there would be a calico bag at the base that would catch the film so it didn't get scratched up on the floor. And you would have all these different pegs that you could organize the film bits that you were cutting with and have them ready at hand in a way that was accessible and somewhat organized. So the concept of a bin comes from that. And when we're in this tool, we make bins to organize media. And we make bins to organize the work that we're going to do. So you can say, I'm making a bin for media, but you can also say, I'm making a bin for sequences. And keep all of your cuts in a particular place. You can make a bin either by right-clicking and selecting New Bin, or you can use the shortcut, which is either Command-B on a Mac or Control-B on a PC, I believe. So if you create a new bin, you can use the bin for all kinds of things. So for me, typical sort of baseline organization tool bins might be maybe having project scenes. Oh, it's misspelled. Golly. Let's get that right, scenes. Having maybe certain types of extra audio like promo music or voiceover or whatever. Having graphics, having my sequences. If I know that this is a scene, it goes inside that folder, so you can actually nest bins. So you can have a bin that has all your scenes in it, and then if you open this bin, you can then open the bin for a particular scene. And you can have many bins inside bins. It just helps you keep your project organized. This is important because if you are going to, say, work as an editor in industry, and somebody comes to you as a director and says, I'd like to look at this shot, you have to be able to find it pretty quickly. And if you're working on a big project with a lot of different scenes and a lot of different files, having a good strategy for organization is important. So when you first open up this tool and you get started with work, the first thing to really do is set up a few bins that will help you to do your work in a way that is efficient and effective. And bins are the way to go. So once you're in a bin and you're looking at media, this doesn't look very meaningful. And so for you, you may want to, say, for instance, switch to the icon view. Icon view lets you look at the media in a way that shows you what's in the file, and if you hover over and scroll, you can actually look at the contents of a file, right? And this can be really handy even in a kind of bird's eye view, because you get a sense of whether a shot has been slated at the front or on the tail, which can be handy. Sometimes people do tail slate shots. It lets you see enough about what the shot is to sort of say, oh, I know this is a take of this, this is a take of this. It's helpful. It is very helpful, right? And here we have, do we have a tail slate? Yeah, we have a tail slate. That's an instance where we have a tail slate. There you go. So these kinds of things will be helpful as you get used to the software. So just know that when you're in the list view, you'll see the name of the shot and its duration, and you'll see, you know, some notes here if in the most basic of way, if you hover over it, just information about the file. When you're in this list view, you actually get a lot more information, and I'll show you why this is important. As you scroll through this bin, you'll see that there's a lot of different columns, right? What you really wind up needing at the first point of working on a project is this information here. Video info, audio info, and we have other information that is here, you know, the frame rate. So the frame rate is really important because that determines this sort of speed that the project media runs at, and we need to take account for that when we set up our sequence, which is the timeline we're going to cut the project on. Other elements that are important to that sequence is the raster settings of the video file, which is the dimensions, the pixel dimensions, and the audio. When we set up a sequence, we need to know all of these things. And so when you first open up a job and you're looking around, do look for this kind of stuff. So what I'll do just to help you understand how this works is I will go back up to my main window here, the project window, where we have our sequences folder. I'll open that sequence bin. I'm going to right click and go New Item, Sequence. When I do this, I'm now confronted with a whole world of options and thises and that's. Now, because this system knows me and it remembers me and it says, hi, how are you? I know you love this setting. It's presented me with a setting that is particularly reasonable for what I'm doing. But having said that, when you first come in here and you've never used it before, you can be going through a number of settings and going, which one's right, which one's right, which one's right, and maybe none of them are right. So here's the thing. You don't need to come in here and use these, right? So what you can do instead, let me just go down here and just make a name, give it a name, right? I don't need to come in here and do that. So you go to Settings, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go all the way up the top, because at the very start of this list is something called Custom. Now, if you just want to enter your particulars that are going to help you get this job done, without thinking about different presets and whether they're right and having to browse for the right one, this is where you can go to do that. So you can choose your time base. It's already currently set at the right one. You can enter the frame size, and this is currently set up. Square pixels, which is what it is. I don't have any fields if it's a progressive scan. You really only have fields on older media when you're dealing with, it is really not that common anymore. You will encounter it sometimes, but not that often. And I have the audio set up to be 48K. So we're good here. This is fine. And you could sort of say, I want maximum bit depth, but it's not important because I know that this media is just not all that. So I'm just going to call this a name, give it a name. And now we have a sequence. What's really important when you first set this up is to double check here. If you see semicolons instead of colons, it means you're working in drop frame and you're working in NTSC. It's not necessarily wrong, it's just different. It has to be right for the media, it has to be right for the situation. Just bear that in mind. But the great thing here is now that we have some media and we have a sequence, it's easier to start looking at the rest of the software and exploring how it works and what it does.